What do you need to include to write an offer to win a bid for a property that you're looking at? So last video, we talked all about a seller concession and how to reduce your closing costs when purchasing a home. And this is all part of the process of just reviewing numbers and kind of getting ready to make the offer. And so what I want to walk you through is the conversation that I have with every buyer before we begin the offer period. Because there are some parts of this that are straightforward, and there are some parts that are not straightforward. And so what I find is before you begin tackling what's a very important decision and you're throwing around some terms, I don't want you learning right then and there about these and then having to act on them. No, there needs to be a gap between when you learn it, allow your subconscious to work on it, ask questions about it, and then be able to do it. If that gap is too narrow, you're going to be stressed. So let's kind of do a deep dive here into all the different things when I recommend making offers on a home. Let's start with what I call the OG3. And these are the three mandatory terms that you need in order to make an offer on a home to purchase. And here's what they are. One, this should be no mistake or no unobvious thing. You have to offer a price. How much are you going to offer for the home? You may decide to offer exactly what it's being listed for, a little bit more, a little bit less. That's a decision between you and your realtor when reviewing a CMA or comparative market analysis based on that property. So the purchase price is one. Number two, we also have to offer what are we going to do as an escrow deposit? How much are we going to include as our good faith deposit? Now, the escrow deposit is just that, good faith deposit. It's put down at the time of signing the contract. It always has to be certified funds. It gets held by either the listing agent, the title company. If there's an attorney involved, they may hold it. And it just sits there. It's just money that sits there when you write the offer and you get the house all the way through the under contract period. And then when you go to close, it's money that's already been given. So you just bring any remainder balance of the cash to close number. So the escrow deposit. What that really does is it protects the seller against you 2 days before closing, stubbing your toe, having an epiphany and say, oh, I can't buy this house in Mount Laurel. I have to move to Fiji. Well, that's great that you've had this epiphany. It's not exactly a legal reason to back out of a contract. And so if you don't want to buy that house at that point in the transaction to go buy the house in Fiji, you may have to forfeit part or all of your escrow deposit to the seller for keeping them in the transaction that long and then breaching the contract at the last minute. So that's kind of what the escrow is for. Higher the escrow is better. A general rule of thumb, 2 to 5% of the purchase price of the home is somewhat appropriate for an escrow deposit. But all of that's negotiable. It just depends on some of the other terms of your deal. Let's talk about number 3. We have the purchase price, we have the escrow deposit, and then we also have to tell them when we are going to close. All terms equal, but this buyer can close in 25 days and this buyer can close in 5 months. Those aren't the same offer. And you may immediately think, well, the buyer that can close in 25 days is the one I want to go with. Not necessarily. What if your new construction project isn't done for 6 months? You may say, well, I'd rather actually have the 5-month buyer because we can drag this out anyway. So anyway, closing date is an important part of that. But those are what I consider the OG3. Those are the only 3 mandatory terms really about making an offer. Now, you obviously have to tell them whether you're contingent or not. You have to tell them what kind of financing you're going to use, if it's going to be cash or one of the 3 mortgage types. That's all boilerplate stuff. But in terms of your offer, these are the things you include. Now, let's jump to the other things. Because I would even say prior to 2020, you didn't really have to dabble too much into these extras because it wasn't all that competitive. I mean, it was for really good homes, and there were occasional homes that got multiple bids, but it really wasn't until kind of the COVID frenzy and then sort of this market that we've been in for 4 years dealing with that we've had to say, hey, we're going as high as we can on the price. We're offering a very competitive escrow. We have all the flexibility in the world on the closing date. We're practically letting the seller pick, but there's 5 other offers that are offering basically all the same things. So we have to figure out, how are we going to differentiate our offer compared to those other ones? And there's a couple other categories that we do it in. Let's talk about the first one of these secondary categories. We'll call it the 4th term, just to stop confusing the OG3. So the 4th thing we would include in our offer is, how are you going to handle the home inspection? Okay. Now this is a big one because look, when we walk through a home, I'm not a structural engineer or a contractor. You're not a qualified, licensed, and insured inspector. When we go see this home, we may see it for 15 minutes, right? 15 minutes. And then we're out of there. We may see 3 homes that day. And then that night, they're like, hey, highest and best is due by tomorrow at noon. And you're like, oh my gosh, let's get an offer in. And we go through our purchase price, our escrow, and closing date. But then we have to decide, what are we going to do about the home inspection? It's hard because we don't really know everything about this home. The home inspection is there to protect you as a buyer. But we may be willing to give up some of our protection if it means making us look more favorable in the eyes of the seller. So let's talk about the 5 things we do for the home inspection. Number 1, and this is the most protective to you as the buyer and the least protective to the seller, and that's actually to do nothing. Inside a New Jersey state contract. Now, PA is a little bit differently for the purposes. I'll kind of stay on the New Jersey side of things. For New Jersey contract, it's very protective actually of the buyer. If there's 10 material defects of that house, the seller agrees to fix 9 of them, but not the 10th item. You can take a look and say, hey, you know what? That 10th item is a big deal for me. The fact that you're willing to do 9 is great, but since you are unwilling to do 1 item that's a defect of this home, I'm not comfortable taking on that problem. I would like to request a cancellation of this contract and a release of my escrow funds back to me. So you'll get your escrow deposit back, but the only money you'll be out at that point might be the cost of the home inspection, right? So I'd rather take my losses there, right? So that would be the first way, and that's very protective. But again, might not be attractive enough for a seller to take your offer. So let's talk about the second thing. And the second one is what I call basically a threshold on repairs. So the contract, or kind of our language, will read as, hey, the buyer is willing to be responsible for the first $5,000 worth of home inspection repairs if found. Okay, so let's work that one out. So we have our home inspection, we find those 10 things, and we say, hey, you know what? Numbers 1 through 8, and we can get quotes, we can get things from contractors and things like that that can corroborate the numbers. But we can say, hey, you know what? Numbers 1 through 8, those are basically worth about $5,000 themselves. So, hey, seller, we are going to take on items 1 through 8. We'll be responsible for those. We'll fix those upon moving into the house. But items 9 and 10, we either want them fixed or we want a credit in lieu of repairs towards those, right? And so then the seller will say, well, great. At least I don't have to worry about 1 through 8. Yeah, I'll repair 9 and I'll give you a $500 credit for 10. Okay, great. Well, you may say like, that's perfect. Yeah, just fix 9, send us an invoice when it's completed, and we'll reduce our closing costs by $500 and we'll take care of item 10, and that'll be our equitable exchange. Okay, that works. So that works a lot too. But sometimes it can be a little difficult because you may have one contractor that says, hey, it'll cost me $12,000 to fix that. You may have somebody else that says it'll only cost me $7,000 to fix it. And you're sort of sitting here like, well, which one are we using for the purposes of corroborating value? So that one can get a little messy. Here's the one that I find is probably one of the more attractive options when you're talking to about a buyer and a seller. This is the one that I've found has gotten the best responses from both parties. And that's saying this language. The buyer will purchase the home in as-is condition with the exception of anything structural, anything safety-oriented, or anything environmentally oriented. And so you say structural, safety, and environmental. Okay, so what's covered? Structural is obviously the structure of the home, the basement walls, the framing, anything like that, any termite damage, that all falls under the structural component. The second one we talk about is anything that has to do with the safety of the home, right? Electric. A lot of electric falls under the safety of the home, but I've also been able to get some other things in there, like let's say on your heater, there's been a backdrafting leak, and that leak has started to get close to electrical components. Well, we could make the supposition that that leak, if continued, could be a safety issue because it could affect the electrical components of your heating element, and deep in the winter, if your heater goes out, that is a safety concern. So we're kind of connecting a few dots here, but that's one of the things with safety. With environmental, there's basically 3 big things I'm trying to protect against under that one. One is radon gas. If there is any radon found above the 4.0 picocuries per liter in the house when we do a radon test, we would want to make sure that the seller is responsible for putting in a mitigation system, maybe about $2,000. We also want to make sure that there are no oil tanks, either buried, abandoned, or anything on the property that are not in use anymore. Those can be a big issue if they begin to leak. And then the last one under environmental is mold. Right? If we have in a basement that has no ventilation, it's getting water, and it's just been sitting there, it's starting to build up, stack about, what are the different mold types? So we want to make sure that the seller takes care of a mold remediation. So safety, structural, and environmental are the exceptions, but everything else we're taking as is. That means in the condition that it currently is, and the seller's not obligated to make repairs. So I have a transaction going on right now where we asked for that, and lucky enough we did because we knew the house needed a lot of cosmetic work. It's dated. The buyer's going to be basically flipping it himself anyway, but we did find about $15,000, $16,000 worth of structural damage, which we were able to negotiate and get them a full credit in order to take care of that repair. All right, so that's kind of the middle one. Now, that's where I would say the tables are the most even between a buyer and seller. I don't have to worry about cosmetic stuff, but I do have to protect myself over big stuff. Now, if we continue to go up this spectrum a little bit and say, all right, let's get even more favorable to a seller. Here are the 2 that It's hard for me to actually recommend these two, right? It's all really important that a buyer has the ability to inspect a home, right? So here are the other two. Buyer is going to purchase the home in as-is condition with inspections for informational purposes only. Okay, now that's a very simple stock phrase. You've probably even seen it on some listings if you've been looking on Zillow, Realtor.com, whatever website. In the description, it'll say this home is being sold in as-is condition. Any inspections are for the buyer's informational purposes only. Here's how that works. You still get to have a home inspection, and you may find 10 things wrong with it. That's for you to repair. That's just so that you understand what you're getting into. Now, you may come into this and say, oh, there's 10 things. Yeah, they're all together. Those 10 things are going to be like $2,000. Okay, that's not a big deal. And half of them don't even have to be fixed right away. I might even have to get to some of them. So you'll say, all right, in that instance, yeah, let's move forward. I'm willing to take that on. That's fine. What if though? What if you do that in a transaction? You go as is with inspections for informational purposes only, and you find like a $25,000 problem. Well, the way you've written this contract and the way we've gotten under contract is saying like, hey, that's just for your informational purposes. We don't have to repair it. Well, you sit here saying like, okay, well, I don't want to inherit a $25,000 problem. What am I going to do? Well, this is where balance is. How much did you put down as your escrow deposit? We talked about that a little bit in the last video. What is that escrow amount, right? Actually, we didn't talk about last video. We talked about early in this video. It's been a long one already. So we have to figure out, am I willing to walk away from my escrow deposit? Well, if you only put down $1,000 in escrow, yeah, I'd rather lose $1,000 than pay $25,000. But what if you put $20,000 down as your escrow? And now you're sitting here saying like, oh my goodness, I'm either walking away from a $20,000 escrow deposit, or I have to eat this $25,000 repair that has to get made. That's a hard decision to make, right? And that's why I generally don't recommend as-is inspections for informational purposes only, unless you are in home trades. If you're a contractor, a plumber, an electrician, you're in one of these fields, you're an engineer, right? You have a family member who's an engineer or a contractor or an inspector who can come and really give you that kind of personal advice that like, yeah, you can go forward with this, you'll be fine. Because as a realtor, we should never tell you, you should choose one of these. We always give you bookends. We always give you a range and say this would be a conservative option. This would be an aggressive option. Where do you feel most comfortable? And then we help you along those lines. Here's the last one for the inspection, and then we're going to jump to the appraisal. The last one that we can offer, which the seller would just be super happy about, would be to waive the home inspection altogether. And that means you're not even allowed to bring an inspector into the home during the under contract. And there's actually like 6 or 7 paragraphs stricken from the New Jersey real estate sales contract that removes any ability to have an inspection, negotiate repairs, or anything. I've only ever had 2 people in my entire 9-year career that actually waived the home inspection. One was my mother on a house that she was going to be flipping, and she is basically a contractor, so she felt comfortable making that assessment because she was going to be tearing this house basically down to the studs anyway. And one other gentleman who just happened to be flush with cash. He didn't really care. Luckily, it all went well. It wasn't a big problem, but we'll be honest, those couple of gray hairs that I have were from those 2 transactions. They were stressful because anything could have gone wrong, and they would have had no recourse to back out unless it would have been forfeiting that escrow. All right. So purchase price, escrow deposit, closing date, how we handle the home inspection. Number 5, how are you going to handle the appraisal? Now, again, we talked about what would happen for an appraisal shortfall, and you can pre-negotiate that into the contract. And we talked a lot about that actually in the last video. This is the one we actually talked in the last video about seller concessions and how to reduce your closing costs. Well, this happens too on the appraisal. We'll say that, hey, buyer will be responsible for up to $10,000 of an appraisal gap if applicable. And that means that if we're under contract for $300, but the home doesn't appraise at $300, it appraises lower, we're willing to come to the table with more cash to protect the seller's bottom line. You could waive the appraisal amount and say, I don't care where it appraises, I'll make up any difference in cash. Same thing, fairly risky. Most of the time, we choose a dollar amount. And here's my general rule of thumb. If a home is listed at $300,000 and you're going to offer $320,000, I would recommend about half of that you should guarantee as an appraisal gap. That would be my general math. If you wanted to just back of the napkin, like, well, how much should I protect? How much should I do? I always say about half the amount you go above their asking price. Now, if you're offering on the home is listed at $300,000 and you're going to offer $270,000, You don't have to put anything in for an appraisal gap coverage. It's pretty obvious this home will appraise at pretty much where they listed it. So if you're going under asking, I don't really use this one. I'll use the inspection one and some of the other ones more, but the appraisal one is really only sort of if I'm going over asking price, I have to kind of put my money where my mouth is to make sure that the seller's going to walk away with what we're promising them. Here's the last category, and this is where we're going to kind of wrap up for this one. It's a miscellaneous section, and it's exactly for that reason. Here's an example of what we did and how it won a buyer a home. So I was working with a couple and they were buying a home in South Jersey here. And we started having a conversation with the listing agent. I asked the agent, as I do on every property, that's how we know what to offer in this miscellaneous section. I said, what's the deal with this seller? I noticed it's an estate sale. Is there anything particular that they're looking for? I know price is important. I'm sure they want to close quickly, but what's most important? Because Connor, this is an estate sale and the 3 kids, they're all in their 60s. 2 of them don't even live in the state, and the third one lives in North Jersey, and he's got a very busy schedule. They have been trying to clean this house out for months, and it's just been so slow. It's just junk rescue after junk rescue. It's just been difficult, and there's a lot of furniture left there, and it's all in really good shape. And so I told them, I said, well, here's the deal. In the contract, it states that the property must be removed of all personal belongings, and it must be broom clean. So I said, here's what we'll do. We'll remove that line from the contract. And you're like, well, is that big of a deal? For the seller, it was. That means that they didn't have to worry about getting another dumpster at the house and continuing to take all of their stuff out. I also knew that my buyers were both coming out of divorces. They had just gotten remarried. This had all happened within the span of like 2 to 3 years. They're now buying their first home together after both being divorced. And they were all living on like apartment furniture. They had kind of just old stuff that they got, and they had this hodgepodge. They're like, Connor, we would be more than okay if we inherited some of her furniture. Some stuff we'll keep, some stuff we'll throw out, but we'll make that decision. So we were able to get the bid. We won the bid $20,000 under the next best offer just because we offered that, hey, don't worry about packing up the furniture. We'll take care of it. So when we make an offer, it's an art and a science. There are some things that are absolutely required, our OG3, and then there are some other items, the inspection, the appraisal, some miscellaneous combination of things that we do in order to make your offer stand out. The one thing I'll say is that, again, through all these videos, I would love it if you use me as your realtor. I'm South Jersey and PA, Jersey and PA, but I understand if you're going to use somebody else, and this is just more educational. Make sure that before your agent submits an offer, they're calling the listing agent. I can't tell you as a listing agent how many times I've just gotten a blind offer. I'm like, I've never spoken to this agent. They have no idea really what the situation is. They sent over an offer that on face value is fine, but if they had just asked like 2 or 3 questions about what's going on our end, they would have recognized that this offer is not going to get the deal done. And this is not at all what the seller is looking for. But they just fired over an offer because they wanted to fire over an offer. So with all that being said, just make sure that when you're doing this offer, they talk to the agent, you get a good feel for the landscape of what's going on, and then you craft your offer accordingly using a combination of these things. All right, that'll do it for us here. The next time we're going to talk about is like, once this offer actually gets accepted and we get under contract, what are the first 2 big things that happen? And that's what's called attorney review here in New Jersey and the home inspection. So I'll see you on the next video and we'll chat about those.